it's important to say that rural charter schools are not always a good idea. They are not a universal solution to rural challenges.
Juliet Squire from Bellwether Education Partners. Thanks so much for being with me.
Always good to be back at AEI.
That's right. Julie is a longtime friend, colleague of the American Enterprise Institute, so it was great to have you participate in the event we had today, but also writing a chapter on rural charter schools for this volume we're doing. So your chapter is on the intersection of this policy intervention, chartering, with this broad area of public education, rural schooling. So why don't you just very briefly, what do we know about these two things when they collide, rural schools and chartering?
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty small sliver of the education policy landscape. There are exactly 769 rural charter schools in the United States as of the 2014-15 school year.
Okay. About how many schools are we talking nationwide? 100,000 or something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah, so we're talking fraction
really
of a fraction.
Really small. And within the charter school sector, only about 8% of charter school students are in rural areas.
Okay, so when people think of charter schools, generally they think of big cities, and they are right to think of it that way.
More than half of charter schools are urban.
That's right, and some are now in suburban areas, and it's expanding there, but still to this point, you're unlikely to find very many charter schools in rural America.
Yep.
So why is that the case? Why did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of potential explanations for this. So one is there are state policies that explicitly prohibit rural charter schools, that charter schools are only allowed in areas with certain thresholds that meet certain thresholds of a student population. So that's one reason.
Okay.
But the other reason is that it's just really hard to do rural charter schools and to do them well. So there are a lot of barriers to opening a good rural charter school. One is just low economies of scale. So we know in rural areas that there are lower economies of scale because whether you have 5 first graders or 25 first graders, you need a first grade teacher. Mm-hmm. And that is even harder for rural charter schools, which usually get about 75 cents on the dollar in funding.
Okay.
So the economies of scale are even harder. There are also big challenges with recruiting and retaining teachers in rural charter schools. There are problems in recruiting and retaining teachers in rural schools generally.
In general.
And then doing it for charter schools is even tougher. And a lot of the reason for that is if you're thinking about opening a school, especially if it's in competition with a district school, you're looking to recruit teachers from a limited talent pool. So you're either going to surrounding towns and recruiting teachers in, which suggests that they won't stay as long because the commute is tough, or you're looking at attracting them away from the district school, which in a rural community where the school is such an integral part of that community, that creates some really interesting and troubling divisions.
Yes.
And so the human capital piece of it is also really big. And then the final thing is that rural charter schools in general really rely on philanthropic funding and grants from the federal government to fund the startup of schools. And that is just less available in rural areas. The philanthropic community is largely focused on urban areas, and rural, there isn't as much to support the opening of a rural charter school.
Okay, so all of that makes sense, but let's take a step back. Actually looking at this from the other side, because some people who don't know much about charter schools or skeptical of them may very well say, okay, I understand things have been really bad for a lot of low-income kids in big cities. The school systems have had a hard time turning around. I don't really like school choice, but maybe charter schools in cities make sense. But why are you trying to start charter schools in rural areas? So what is the rationale? Why do we even care about this subject?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because there are a lot of policies that I think people try to translate from the urban context to the rural context that don't work that well.
Okay.
So for instance, teacher evaluation, largely created as a way to help urban superintendents sort of get past the due process for an ineffective teacher and remove them from the classroom. And that's sort of been, we've sort of tried to implement that across the entire education policy space. In a rural community where there's a limited talent pool, again, the challenge of teacher quality isn't always the ability to evaluate and dismiss a teacher, it's the ability to replace them. So the one example of a policy that doesn't translate very well. And a lot of people say that charter schools are one of those policies.
That's right.
And I think that there is some truth to that.
Okay.
There really are limits to choice and competition in communities that are small, that have a low number of students and therefore a limited ability to support more than one option. But there are some rural communities that are big enough to sustain multiple options, and there are rural charter schools that exist in those contexts.
Can you pause there? Because
Yeah.
let's make sure people understand this. If you are in New York City, or even like a smaller community within New York City, Queens, the Bronx, lots of population in one area.
Yeah.
So if you start a charter school, it might pull 2%, 3% of kids from neighborhood schools. But in a rural area, if
Yeah.
in a 50 square mile radius area, there's one school and
Yeah.
you start a charter school,
That's exactly right.
it's going to pull
50%?
of those kids,
Yeah.
and that could have a huge financial influence on that district, on that school.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the choice and competition argument for charter schools in rural areas is a little bit limited because of that.
Right, because couldn't someone reasonably say, yeah, chartering might be great for some number of kids, but essentially what you're doing is undermining every other public school and the district, and you're doing way more harm than good.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, then why even bother? What's the virtue in trying to do charter schooling?
So first of all, I mean, I think that rural charter schools have mixed outcomes, right? So we have to be really honest.
So we have data on this.
We have data on this. They have really mixed outcomes. So in no way are rural charter schools always a good idea. And in many cases, they are probably a very bad idea.
So the data that we have comparing reading and math scores of rural charter schools to rural schools, comparable rural schools, doesn't always show a gigantic or even any rural charter school advantage.
Yeah, and sometimes a disadvantage.
And this is different than in urban areas, right, where we actually have some data
Yeah.
that some of these urban charters are doing much better.
Yep.
So this is another yellow flag, probably.
Yes, exactly. And so I think it's important to say that rural charter schools are not always a good idea. They are not a universal solution to rural challenges.
And this is coming from two people who like school choice, are open to
Yeah.
the idea of chartering. We're
Yeah.
saying in rural areas, it might not always be.
Yeah, it's a little touch and go. And I think that there are circumstances where they have been really successful.
Okay, what are those circumstances?
Yeah, so one would be so there are a couple of reasons that people found rural charter schools. One is choice and competition. We've talked about that.
Yep.
But a second one is in order to maintain local control over a school. So this is an example from Crestone, Colorado.
Okay.
So the local community school was being closed by the district, and they wanted to maintain a local school.
It was being closed presumably because of low enrollment. It just wasn't efficient to keep it
wasn't
open.
financially efficient to keep it open.
Okay.
And so the school was being closed, and the students were going to have to ride a bus, not that far, 12 miles, but through the mountains in wintertime in Colorado. It sounds treacherous, like it could be treacherous, to a nearby school that wasn't that great. And so the community said, we don't want to do that. We're going to start a charter school.
To replace the district school that you're closing.
Exactly. And so it was a way for them to take ownership over their own school, and they've developed a curriculum that draws on the local community, and it's actually been able to attract more families into that community because it's become a hub.
So this is fascinating because charter laws often in people's minds are associated with, okay, we're going to empower communities and families to start schools because the district school to which our kids are assigned isn't doing so well. What you're saying is the exact same mechanism. A charter law can allow a set of families in a community to save public education in their geographic area.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of what we see in school turnaround is like the number one thing that really matters is buy-in from the community and from the staff. So if you're thinking about a rural school that's struggling either academically or financially, the chartering mechanism, that ability to take ownership over the school and its design and its success is really powerful.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So your paper also talks about autonomy, though,
Yes.
that like the right of a school to own itself, to do what it wants, so it can best serve its kids in the way that its community decides.
Yeah, and that's actually happened in a slew of rural districts in Oregon that have converted their schools into charter schools in order to take advantage of that increased autonomy.
Wow. So what does that actually include? The right to, for example, not have a collective bargaining agreement, to hire differently, to longer school day?
It depends a lot on the state law, and I'm not an expert on Oregon state law, but I think, yes, the collective bargaining thing is probably a big piece of it. Curriculum design, school hours, the school calendar. I know in Oregon, one of the charter schools has really built an entire curriculum around the natural resources that they have in their community. It's very STEM focused because they're in a very biodiverse area, it happens to be. And so they have been able to build a curriculum around that maybe they wouldn't have been able to do if they'd been accountable to the same sort of stringent requirements that district schools have to follow.
Okay, so pulling back just chartering generally, New Orleans, virtually all public school kids are now in charter schools. In Washington, D.C., it's about 50%. So it's really expanding, and it continues to expand in a bunch of cities. What you're saying is there has been a break in rural areas, and actually that break is legitimate. It makes sense. But maybe the break has been pressed a little too hard. There could be reasons why more communities need to expand or consider this. So at the very beginning, you talked about maybe philanthropy could do things differently, maybe state policy could do things differently. What would you recommend to do this prudently as opposed to go too far, too fast?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, one, eliminating these blunt prohibitions in state law is really important. In order for there to be rural charter schools, you actually have to allow rural charter schools at the highest level. But I think that also then requires, on the flip side, investing in the capacity of authorizers and oversight agencies to effectively determine when a rural charter school makes sense. And
what's an authorizer?
The entities that are vested by the charter school law with the power to give an organization, a 501c3, the power to operate a charter school.
Okay, so if I and my friends want to start a charter school, we have to go to you, the authorizer. You give us permission to start the school, and then you keep track of what we're doing to make sure we're actually doing good things for kids.
Exactly. And so authorizers, and here in D.C. is probably one of the best in the country, the Public Charter School Board, right? And they have amazing processes to evaluate the viability of a charter school, down to the human capital, to the community engagement efforts that they're going through, the financial viability of the school, all of these things. And all of that will look different for a rural charter school.
In what ways? What should they need to do differently?
So if you take the challenge of economies of scale in rural communities, right? The financial viability of a rural charter school is going to be very different than the financial viability of an urban charter school. I don't know the specifics because I'm not a financial expert, but you can imagine that you're going to need a longer leash.
That's right.
Of finances to be able to start the school, get a facility.
That's right.
And then the economies of scale are going to require you to have maybe more of a reserve or maybe less of a reserve. I don't know. But it seems like it's reasonable to think it will be different.
That's right. Because if you're in New York City and you potentially have access to 1.1 million kids, that's one thing. But if you are in a small rural community and your break-even point is you need at least 250 kids to keep up and running, and you have to worry every year, can you get up to 250? You're going to need some financial flexibility.
Yep.
Presumably.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about philanthropy? What should donors know when it comes to rural charter schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for them to understand where rural charter schools have been successful and understand the conditions for that success so they can look for it. And to the extent that they can prioritize it in their grant making, if they feel like that's something that they want to do, complement the urban strategy with a more rural strategy, to just understand what the conditions are for success and then put the money where those conditions are met.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for coming in to talk about this really interesting subject.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. That's the end of our discussion with Julie Squire. Thanks so much for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AI scholars to cover here on Viewpoint. And to learn more about rural education or charter schools, check the links in the description below.